Quez, who you'll be hearing more from in the second half of this webinar, and Caroline Stokes, who is monitoring the chat and will help make sure that everyone gets their questions answered, either in the chat or when we have opportunities for folks to take themselves off mute and ask their questions. Before I get started on the content of this presentation, I do just want to make very clear that the funding opportunity we're talking about today is only for organizations that are applying for grant funding. So to be eligible, you need to be a nonprofit, a local unit of government, or a planning district commission. So if you are an individual who is in need of assistance with your rent or any other kind of direct service, please feel free to email me. Caroline, you could put my email in the chat, and I can direct you to where resources are available in your local community. But I don't want you to waste your time attending this webinar if you're an individual looking for direct assistance. This webinar is only for eligible organizations who are applying for grant funding. So just wanted to make that clear to everyone. And with that, we'll start with the presentation. So feel free throughout the webinar to put any questions you may have in the chat. Like I said, Caroline Stokes will be monitoring that. And then there are multiple times throughout the webinar where we pause for questions and you can take yourself off mute to discuss them. So a little bit of background about the Virginia Eviction Reduction Pilot, also known as VERP. Its origin story begins back in 2016. You may be familiar with the author and sociologist Matthew Desmond. He wrote a really incredible book called Evicted. It won the Pulitzer Prize. And shortly after that, Matthew Desmond won the MacArthur Genius Award. And he used the funds associated with that award to open the Princeton Eviction Lab. And the Eviction Lab allowed us for the first time around the country to really have insight into the real data that told a story of what we all knew was happening, but that hadn't been presented in such a way before. And his findings revealed that Virginia is home to 5 of the top 10 highest evicting large cities in the country. We also have another, I think, 2 cities, 2 of the top 10 highest evicting mid-sized cities. So that was a headline on the cover of the front page of the New York Times. And in response, then Governor Northam and that General Assembly passed $3.3 million to launch VERP. Now that was in 2020. So VERP was initially put on the back burner when the pandemic hit, and we all understood that it was going to take more than $3 million to keep people housed. But in late 2020, early 2021, we did finally launch the first round of funding for VERP. It worked in, it ran parallel with the Virginia Rent Relief Program for the first year or so. And then the second round of funding came out in 2021. At that point, we began to tweak the guidelines so that VERP would maintain this very flexible financial support for eligible households, but that also began to address what we understand to be a systems level problem. And that second round of funding involved encouraged applicants to provide court navigation services, which you'll hear more about as the webinar continues. And in 2022, we issued our third year of funding. It was actually year one of a 2-year grant award covering calendar year 2023 and 2024. The reason that we're here today is that we have some supplemental funding to grant out. We have $475,000 that we did not expect to release at this time. One of our grantees as an organization made the decision to step away from eviction prevention work entirely and focus more on their core areas of business. So as a result, we have this unexpected $475,000 to distribute, and that's what we're here to talk about today. And we'll refer to that as supplemental funding throughout this webinar. Are you able to advance the slide? Thank you. You heard me mention, taking a systemic approach to this work. A big piece of that includes the gathering and coordination of stakeholders who sit in a seat or play a role that allows the system to respond differently. So that could be landlords, it could be folks who work in courthouses, either judges or clerks. Legal aid could not be a more important partner in this work, as well as any other pro bono attorneys who are willing to lend their expertise. Schools are an important partner. Children are overwhelmingly the people who most commonly experience an eviction. And the goal of all of that is to create a coordinated approach at a local and regional level that prevents and diverts evictions whenever possible. I mentioned that we're in this 2-year funding cycle. So you are sort of hearing from us almost halfway through this 2-year funding cycle. But it's out of step due to the supplementary nature of these dollars, the $475,000 available now. Next slide, please. So you've heard me talk about systems and systemic issues a couple of times, and I just want to make clear what we mean when we talk about that. To put it simply, we don't approach this work as though it is the individual households who need to be fixed. We approach this work as the system that these households interact with being in need of fixing, right? Our vision is that evictions in Virginia will one day become rare, and when they cannot be prevented, that the impact on a household will be brief and that the experience will be humane, all while continuing to provide that really flexible financial assistance that households need when they find themselves at risk of losing their housing. And we're going to talk about the difference between prevention and diversion in just a moment. So just a few words about the geographic targeting associated with these dollars. When the General Assembly passed this $3 million, they named several localities that should receive scoring preference points. So I don't think there's anyone who's joined by phone. Maybe Caroline, you could correct me if I'm wrong. So the localities that you see on this slide are all localities that at the direction of the General Assembly will receive priority scoring points in our review process. At the bottom, you'll see that we only fund one grantee per locality. And so with that, I just want to mention that the localities you see here highlighted in yellow Chesapeake, Hampton, Newport News, Norfolk, and Portsmouth are all places where VERP is where we already have an existing VERP grantee. This is not an inclusive list of all of the places where our VERP grantees are operating, but these are the priority locations where we already have an existing VERP grantee. So we would not be accepting any new, we would not be awarding funds to any new organization in Chesapeake, Hampton, Newport News, Norfolk, or Portsmouth, because these are all priority localities that already have VERP coverage. Next slide, please. So this funding does not require a match. However, organizations or applicants that do have match contributions, either in kind or a cash match, will receive scoring preference per the state budget directive. And that can include any local COVID or other emergency resources that may still be available in your locality. I want to make really clear, though, that if your budget or your narrative says that you have a cash match, you will not receive the scoring preference unless you have included the MOUs, award letters, letters of commitment, or any other formal communication that you can provide to us proving that that match is already in place or has been committed. There have been a number of times where we've gotten applications where a cash match or an in-kind match is mentioned or included in a budget, but no documentation of that was attached to the application. And in those cases, those applicants are not given the additional points through the scoring process. So I just wanted to underscore the importance of including that documentation if indeed you do have a match to bring to the table for this work. I think I've talked a little bit about systems change, hopefully enough. We're obviously trying to address not just the symptoms. We understand as, excuse me, as direct service providers, you are working with and treating the symptoms of this epidemic all the time when you're interacting on a household by household level, but that's really the symptom of a much larger problem with its own root causes, right? It's not, again, it's not the households that are broken, it's the systems that they're interacting with. And we strongly believe that the kind of systems change we're looking for requires not just adjustments and transformations for your own policies, practices, and procedures within your own organization, but to look for opportunities for transformative changes to practices and policies with all of the folks that are around the table with you. So your court system, your legal aid, your landlords, how schools handle children that are facing risk of eviction. It's that, collective impact model, that collaboration of diverse stakeholders who have the power and influence to make those kinds of changes at a local, regional, or state level. And you'll hear a little bit more about examples of that later in the webinar. So I do just want to define for you all how we differentiate between eviction prevention and eviction diversion, particularly because this is different than how prevention and diversion are defined in the homelessness space. So we define eviction prevention services as anything that's provided to a household before they receive an unlawful detainer, also known as a UD. The unlawful detainer is the point at which the court becomes involved, and regardless of the outcome, the unlawful detainer, the UD, sits on the tenant's record forever, with one recent exception involving expungements. But so really, prevention is ideal, and that can look like the short-term flexible financial assistance I've talked about, case management to make sure that a household has help with anything else that they might need. And through VERP, it's possible to help them with childcare, transportation, medical bills, employment, access to employment, and also can include mediating between a landlord and a tenant with the goal of a landlord choosing another solution other than an unlawful detainer. Once that unlawful detainer or UD is issued, we define the work as then being in the diversion space, because now the court is involved. The UD is on a tenant's record, and the goal is still to prevent an eviction from happening. And that can look like the court navigation work you're going to hear Gabby talk about. It definitely still can include the flexible financial assistance. It should absolutely include legal aid or other pro bono attorneys. It's possible. There are many examples where a VERP grantee is able to negotiate with the landlord in the diversion space, influencing them to dismiss the unlawful detainer, which would allow a tenant to get it expunged off their record in exchange for payment from our VERP grantee, allowing the tenant to relocate outside of the peak crisis moment of an eviction. And so that's where we get to really the impact being brief and the experience being humane. But all grantees and any eligible applicant must provide both prevention and diversion. If your organization is only providing one of those, you need to partner with another organization to provide the other. So if your organization says, yep, we've got prevention, no problem, but we don't know, what our role would be in the diversion space, you need to find a sub-grantee and, come up with a formal partnership with an organization that would provide the diversion activities as well. Again, I don't think anyone's joined the call, but just who's eligible for this funding, right? This webinar, this funding opportunity is not for individuals in need of direct assistance. It's for units of local government, nonprofit organizations, PDCs. Those are all eligible entities to apply for this supplementary funding. Institutions of higher education may also apply as a partner or a sub-grantee, but they alone could not be the lead applicant. And then all eligible entities need to be registered in CAMS. You'll hear a lot more about that. It's DHCD's in-house grants management system. So the requirements are that you've registered in CAMS, and Gabby will talk more about how to do that. The relationships between all partners mentioned in your application, like legal aid, like the courthouse, like perhaps a public housing or a landlord, must be clearly articulated and backed up with formal documents. So you are allowed to subgrant out some of this work, but you must include MOUs or some other formal, contractual partnership agreement. And we at DHCD cannot enter into any contract with a grantee that has any outstanding audit findings, IRS findings, DHCD monitoring findings, or any other compliance issues. So this is our first opportunity to break for questions.
There are no
Yes,
questions in the chat, Cinta.
Thank you. I just heard someone take themselves off mute, I think.
yes. I'm Chris McGill. I'm with Chaz, Executive Director of Chaz. I just had a question. My question would be, is this something that has to go through FHN or they will have to apply for and they act as a pass-through, for the funds, or do we just do it ourselves through
What is
CAMS?
FHN?
Foothills Housing Network. So they're our COC
Oh,
yeah.
but you're a representative from a nonprofit, right?
Yes, so I'm representative of Chaz, Culpeper Housing and Shelter Services. And
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if I could, because we're registered for CAMS and we do our VHSP and our HTF grants, but I was just trying to figure out if that's something that we have to have FHN or the COC apply for and we got to go through them, or is that something that we can just do ourselves?
You can do it yourself. When Gabby, I think, is going to take over as soon as we're done with questions here, but we do want to see that you have your local COC at the table,
Okay.
helping you make programmatic decisions or advising you on the programmatic decisions that you have. But eviction prevention work operates outside of the COC structure. And you do not have to apply through them in order to be eligible for these dollars.
And one more question, to be eligible for those dollars, is this just once a year in the fiscal year? I'm just trying to get some information on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. It makes sense. So because this money, I've mentioned it's supplementary money. It was originally granted to an existing VERP grantee. And we came up on year 2 of the 2-year grant cycle, and their organization at the board level made the strategic decision to back out of eviction prevention work and focus on their core service model, which was not eviction prevention. So as a result, we know what the end, how the timeline ends, but the beginning of the timeline is one that we have a little less control over. I'll explain that. So these dollars will be awarded in this calendar year and must be expended by December 31st, 2024. The application is obviously due February 29th. Our team will be reviewing and scoring all applications in very short order. We should have our review and scoring done really in a matter of days after February 29th. At that point, however, our recommendations then go to the governor's office. And that is a point in the process where our team just loses control over the timeline. So I can't.
Yeah, that was going to be my third, I guess, and final question would be, what will be the timeline to kind of expect it? More like, 4 or 5 months or 6 months from the actual submission. But I do know that you all, have so many other things going on. So I'm sure that the timeline is kind of hard to narrow down a window when the funds will be expected.
Yeah, only because it's recommendations we're making to the governor's office, and before we can announce our funding decisions, we need the governor's office's approval. So our team will work, at lightning speed to review and score these applications. And then I just can't make promises around how long it will take for those announcements to become public. But I can tell you that the funding period does end on December 31st. And then I'll just add, like I said, we're doing this midstream in a 2-year grant cycle. So the next opportunity to apply where the full $3 million is on the table, there will be an application issued in the summer of this year, summer of 2024, with applications due in the fall of 2024. And then contracts that will cover calendar years 2025 and 2026. And that's the more typical, cycle for this funding is 2 calendar years at predictable times. But this particular supplementary funding opportunity was just not predicted by us.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for your question. Okay, I will turn it over to you, Gabby, unless there's any other questions before our next Q&A break.
There's one question in the chat about examples for eviction prevention and diversion, but I figured we could get through this next part and hopefully that answers your question. If not, we won't got to talk that through then. But hi, my name is Gabby. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of the program design. So the last time VERP was available as a statewide application, moving costs and application fees were not allowable expenses as financial assistance with VERP. However, for this tranche of funding and for current VERP grantees in 2024, it is again an allowable expense for participants between 31 and 80% AMI. And this is in an attempt to not duplicate any funds or as prevention services and other homeless funds can cover that for people who are under 31% AMI, 30% but below. For this supplemental funding, because new applicants that are not existing grantees may not already have a court navigation system set up, it is not a required element for your application. However, if you do set one up and you do want to submit your application with the court navigation, or you do have a court navigation program, it is an eligible expense for you to use these funds for. Preference points will be given for applicants with a court navigation program. And similar to the match, you would need to prove these you would need to submit documentation proving these relationships in forms of MOUs, letter of supports with any court programs, as well as policies and program policies for your court navigation program. So this is the full list of the activities that are included in the pilot program. The next few slides will get into them in detail. So we're going to keep going through them. So the first one is eviction prevention assistance programs. So that's providing the regular rental assistance to arrears, to prospective rent up to 6 months, or anything before that unlawful detainer has been filed. Diversion assistance would be similarly those assistances, but after the unlawful detainer is filed. Your VERP program also must include initiatives or partnerships that promote systems change. That was mentioned earlier, and the local advisory committee portion, which we'll be coming to, is a aspect of the program where you'll be able to show this part. Senta?
Thanks, Gabby. Sorry to interrupt. I did just want to make sure that our audience knows that VERP was designed to be, as upstream and as flexible as possible. So theoretically, a household would not need to be behind on their rent in order to get help. I often use myself as an example. There was a time in my life where I was a single mom to two very young kids. I was lucky enough to be a mom with a mortgage rather than a lease. But with one income, a mortgage, and daycare for two young kids, there were plenty of months where I played grace periods off of each other. I always made sure that my mortgage was paid on time, but I would sometimes pay daycare late. So in theory, you could have, a single mom, that's who's most likely to experience an eviction along with her kids, who has, by the grace of whoever, managed to keep up with her rent, but she's 3 weeks behind on her childcare. She knows she's about to lose her childcare. Once she loses that, she won't be able to work and will not be able to pay rent. So just to dive a little deeper into that question of what's an example of prevention, it could be, prevention could be used to support a household with really any cost that's standing in the way of them maintaining their housing. That's the design and the theory. I do understand that among our existing 6 grantees, they are triaging the people who come to them. There are more people who come to them for help than they are able to serve. And when you're triaging needs like that, the majority of the time rent is what people are getting help with. But I did just want to maybe paint like a broader picture of what prevention activities could look like.
Thanks. And I just wanted to, I see in the chat, but yes, you must include all of these that we're going through right now are required elements of the program, and we'll get into the budget line items that are even more specific in coming slides. Yes, so moving on. So like I said, the court navigation piece is optional for this application cycle. However, if you do include a court navigation program, these would be the expectations of it. These programs are designed to are court-based and designed to be to increase communication between judges, the eviction prevention and diversion staff, and tenants in navigating the court system. And that can include things like helping tenants navigate the eviction process, referring them to other sources of assistance, or helping tenant complete forms. And these are just some examples. And like I said before, in order to receive the preference points, you would need to have an existing partnership with courts and legal aid providers with an MOU and the program policies, and those would be submitted with your application. Continuing on, outreach and resource navigation. We want the onus to be on us, the system, to seek out those who are in emergency situations rather than putting that burden on them to find the right door for assistance. So proactive outreach is part of the program design, as well as language access, prioritizing that in elements of program design and outreach strategies. For programs also must provide an opportunity for individuals with lived experience to be involved in the development, implementation, and evaluation of the VERP project, and that's often through inclusion on the advisory committee. Coordination with partners and stakeholders, and which is the local advisory committee, as well as other relationships, and the referrals to SNAP, TANF, WIC, and LIHEAP. So diving more into the advisory committee, each grantee is required to have coordination through this advisory committee. And it's really an attempt to get all the important players in a room to really make the systems change that we would like to see with eviction prevention and diversion. So this is where a representative from a local COC would be involved, a representative of workforce development, a local DSS, legal aid, a representative of the district court or bar association, a public housing authority, representatives of the associations representing landlords, housing counseling agency or program, conflict resolution, person with lived experience, organizations representing communities of color, organizations was experience serving non-English speakers, tenant advocacy groups if they're present in the community, as well as centers for independent living. And these would all be required members of this committee, and you would include this in an attachment with your application as well. So eligible activities in the actual program management system, this is what the budget and line items would consist of. So we have housing financial assistance, which would be that short, divided into that short term up to 6 months, rent assistant, ongoing up to 1 month, and arrears, utilities, moving costs, and application fees. Also stabilization support services, that would be the childcare assistance, any work supports or transportation assistance, more of the flexible financial category, prevention activities, case management, capacity building, housing counseling, programmatic staff, diversion activities, outreach and engagement, and administrative costs, which are limited to 5% of total funds expended at the end of the grant period. So participant eligibility for a VERP program, DHCD requires the use of a intake and eligibility form that we have designed. And if your organization would like to use their own, or they have their own intake form that they would like to incorporate, that they would like to use, you would have to incorporate all of the elements asked in the DHCD version of the intake and eligibility form. And so these are an attempt to help with that triaging that Sento was discussing earlier of to identify some of the highest risk factors of those who are going to experience an eviction or housing instability, and to really target assistance to those who need it most. Housing first approach. The VERP program is designed to take a housing first approach, and hope you may already know about it, but if you are not familiar, it is an understanding that people need basic necessities like food and place to live before attending to things less critical, like getting a job or budgeting or attending to substance use issues. The VERP assessment eligibility tools should use a housing first approach, and we, as the spirit of the program, is to really screen people in versus out. So if someone doesn't have an income, that should not be the only element that makes someone ineligible. There is more information, but is there any questions so far? Okay. Feel free to continue putting them in the chat if you remember right as I keep going. So data collection and evaluation. There is a lack of eviction data across the Commonwealth and in many other across the United States, really, and to really understand eviction trends and the impact of our programs. So we work closely with a third-party program evaluator, and who, upon receiving this assistance, that grantee would be expected to participate in the evaluation done by RVA Eviction Lab. And it would be expected that the grantees participate through data collection, interviews, and whatever else is needed to successfully evaluate the program. For reporting, VERP grantees would be, for this funding, would be required to submit up to 2 reports. That would depend on how long the grant ends up being. At the very least, it would be a final report at the end of the grant. So these reports are used to really track program activities and impact in a more quantitative way, while the program evaluation explores more of a qualitative experience. The application, you may be familiar, is closed on February 29th at midnight, and all applications must be submitted through CAMS. So this will be uploaded, this presentation, a recording of this presentation will be uploaded to the website. So some of these next slides are kind of guides that will be helpful in your applying on your own. So I will move through some of these. When using CAMS, make sure it could time out and lock you out. So we recommend you work in Microsoft Word or some sort of program software like that and copy and paste the final into CAMS when you're ready to submit. We can only take text answers. So if you have any graphics or tables or anything you'd like to share with us, we would ask that be included in a separate attachment. And we're going to go through some of these attachments, what that looks like too. So this will be your project information that you fill out in CAMS, the project budget, those line items we discussed earlier, the narrative questions, the attachments. The next slide is a little easier to read. So with your application, what's required is an implementation timeline, VERP policies and procedures. If you're applying, if you're applying and trying to get the preference points, we would need those court navigators, policies and procedures. The intake form, unless you're using our template, the eligibility form, unless you're using the DHCD template, any MOUs for match, or that's an excellent. Any MOUs or letters of commitments, agreements for any partnerships, match, your advisory committee list, and then optional attachments is a space for you to submit any of those graphics that you might want to. In CAMS, for looking at your status of your application, it is if it still says incomplete, we do not have it. So make sure you press save and submit to ensure your application comes to us on our side. And you will know that by it saying pending instead of incomplete. So this is also in the program guidelines that are available on the website, but this is the evaluation criteria for applications. The three main categories are need, approach, and capacity, and the points that are associated with them. And to be eligible, you must score at least 60 points. The preference points are listed on this slide. So we'll from the required ones to the match to current grantees, as well as the MOU if for court navigation documents. Included here are some resources for data if you would like assistance in for help for creating your applications. If you need any technical assistance with CAMS, here is an email for that. If you have any questions about the content of the application, send to Leslie's email, again, is up. And the help desk it works from 9 to 5. So, make sure that if you have any questions that they're during business hours. And that is the last slide. So if there are any questions, please unmute or put in the chat.
I do have a quick question. So, if we are unable to get an entire kind of lead advisory council together, but we have ideas, or at least I've been in conversation with some people, but not necessarily been able to put one together from all of those different agencies, is that sufficient enough, or are you looking for by the 29th really having those like set in stone of who is on the advisory council, just because of the turnaround time between now and the 29th?
Some to jump in if you think different, but I think it's okay, especially like the turnaround time to just put who, if you have pending or yeah, that would be just articulate that in the space.
You just want to see that the process has already started and that, we're looking into, or at least have some individuals that would be on that council.
Yes, and we would expect it to be as complete as possible by the beginning of the grant period, though.
Okay, sounds good.
And that, and just to expand on Gabby's answer, that is true for the advisory committee. Like, I don't think we expect an MOU from every single entity that's going to serve on the advisory committee. And we have accepted applications in the past that indicate that, you know, you've reached out and this is who you hope and anticipate will serve on the advisory committee. But it is more like, if you're going to partner with legal aid in order to provide court navigation services, that's the sort of thing we would want to see an MOU for. Or if you're going to subgrant to another organization to provide diversion services, that's the sort of thing that we need to see an MOU for. But names for the advisory committee as best as possible, or, you know, if you've reached out to an organization and they've said, yes, we'd be happy to, I'm not sure which team member is available yet, you can put the name of the organization rather than an individual's name.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you.
And if any members from your organization can count as like lead COC or something that is listed there, then that would count. You can list people from your own organization.
Okay.
You're a
And
housing counseling organization, you can serve as the housing counseling organization, for example.
okay. And we will, and I'm sure that this will come, but in summer of 24, if this is something that we're interested in applying for, but necessarily want to develop it a little bit further before we apply for this funding, this will be something then that we can come to you all at that time when we get the when we get the new application and everything and really go through that process then.
Yes, absolutely. And just, I just want to say that we recognize, you know, the turnaround time that's being required of you all. We recognize that as less than ideal. It's not what we would hope for either. So when the full $3 million becomes available to apply for again, we're very intentional about providing as much time as possible. We understand this is an onerous application, that the work is hard, it requires pulling together a lot of partners. So, I mean, when the application for the full 3 million is released in the summer, we typically provide at like a minimum of 2 months for organizations to work on their applications, sometimes even a little more than that. So if this is not the best time for your organization, we understand, and there will be, you know, more time and another opportunity in the summer. I will say that for this supplemental funding, we are not requiring the court navigation. As Gabby mentioned, it's optional, but for our existing and traditional VERP grantees, court navigation is required, and it will be required for the applications that are released this summer as well.
Okay.
We can stay on for a few more minutes if there are any additional questions. And if you have a question that comes up for you after this call ends, please feel free to reach out to me directly. And we will also be compiling a list of FAQs, and we'll post those on the website too. So you can see what questions other people have had and how we've answered them.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. I appreciate your interest in this really important work. I know you're all busy, so thank you for giving us your time. And thank you for putting on your thinking caps about how to solve this in your local communities.
I do just want to ask Senta and Gabriella. So I know, Senta, that we had spoke, I think, last year about applying for SJV. And at the time, Erica was still here. And so I'm sure you know now that we have a new senior director, and I'm not sure if she was able to make it to this morning's meeting. So I'm going to be talking to her about this, and I might just be reaching out to you to have a separate conversation with her if she has any additional questions. But I just wanted to let you know that that might be coming, just based on what she thinks about applying for the program.
Sounds great. I'm totally open to the conversation. You serve an area of such high need.
Yes. Yeah.
I get contacted from tenants in your service area every day. So be happy to
Absolutely.
have that conversation.
Okay. And I actually did just have one more question. So you said, so the court navigation program is not required now, but let's say we were to apply for this funding, awarded this funding, when the application were to reopen, that at the time would then be required, correct? Just so that I'm making sure. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. It's a hard the court navigation work requires like a lot of,
Yeah.
convincing judges, court systems. It's a time and labor intensive, and we just acknowledge that a lot of organizations might not be able to pull that off by February 29th,
Right.
which is why we made it optional. It does come with preference points. But really it is, I really believe it's like the core systems change level of this work. We've seen some really incredible transformations happen inside courthouses, where court actually is a place where sometimes good things can happen.
Right.
So it is really important to us that remains a required component of this work. We just know that given the timeline and the amount of money available for this unique opportunity, it wouldn't have made sense for us to make it required for this time.
Okay. Sounds good. I'm sure I'll be reaching out to you and connecting myself, you and Katie together to have a meeting, hopefully by Friday. So I appreciate you guys doing the presentation and thank you all for the work that you do.
You as well. Thank you all for
Thanks.
coming.